Okay, everyone, thank you very much for your time to participate in the webinar. And then today it is a kind of special webinar because I am not going to be the main speaker. There are two great lawyers that today's webinar are going to speak. Then one is Mr. Jorge, and then another person is Miss Cristiana. And then they are belong to the Ishara Advogados, and then they are very familiar with the area of labor and also teleworking. So as you know, the today topic, it is about the teleworking and then home office. So due to the pandemic situations, there are a lot of companies, and most of companies are trying to apply for the better situations in order to work efficiently, and the most companies start applying for the working in home office. So I hope this webinar is very opportunity for all of you. And then also for everyone, thank you very much for your time to join the webinar. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Tamura-san. Cristiana, it's a pleasure to have you with mine here in this very unique opportunity. First of all, I'd like to apologize for not speaking Japanese. Although I have my surname in Japanese, unfortunately I didn't learn how to speak Japanese. So we are going to conduct this lecture in English. Okay. For us, it's an honor to be here with Tamura-san and her company in order to clarify an important aspect about this such important way of working. Okay, it's a way of working that got strength after the pandemic COVID-19, especially in Brazil, where we are one of the worst countries in terms of the number of victims, in number of cases of COVID. And considering this scenario, consider these particularities here, we had to adopt in a massive way the telework and the home office in Brazil. Based on that, I would say that the first thing is our idea here is to conceptualize the homework, the telework here, how it is viewed, the basic concepts. We are going to distinguish the telework and the home office as well. They are not identical concepts based on our Brazilian labor law. We will go through the basic background legislation about the home office or telework, the teleworking in Brazil. What are the main cautions that the employer should have, and so on. After that, right, Grace, we will go through a special measures that were ruled by the Brazilian government while the pandemic situation. Apart from the legislation of teleworking, the ordinary one, the statutory one, legislation, we had special measures ruled by the Brazilian government in order to flexibilize, to get more easier to implement the telework while the COVID, the pandemic. So we will say a little bit about that as well. After that, we will compare the statutory legislation from one hand vis-a-vis these special measures made by the Brazilian government. But one important thing, those special measures has already expired. We don't have the special measure anymore. But it is important to go through but we think that it is important to talk about these special measures because it's important to pay attention, to call the attention the employers in order to advise them if they made everything according to the special measures in a fine way. That's why we believe that it's important to go through the special measures as well. After that, we go through the risks. I mean, if we don't observe the what is written by the law here in Brazil, what are the risks? What are the main aspects that we should observe? And if we don't, what are the consequences in terms of the liabilities, in terms of litigation, in terms of investigation by the Brazilian labor authorities? Okay. And then to finalize here, we go through a Q&A here and questions and answers sectors. We will present to you the main or the most common questions about the telework in Brazil, and then leave you alone, give you freedom to present any question that you believe that it can be important for you to be clarified and so on. That's the man here, our man timeline and main matters that we will talk about. Okay, Tamura-san? Okay, Christina?
Yes.
Okay, we have prepared here a presentation, a very practical presentation for you, just to guideline here about the issues that we are going to talk about. Okay, let's go to the first slide here. Okay. Of course, that before discussing any legal matters, important to establish here a concept. Exactly, because if you know exactly what is the concept, the chances of you make any mistake in the future will be lower, because you know exactly what is the thing that you should pay attention and you should have in your mind. So the part of the concept is very important. That's why we decided to put it here in a very humble words, just to be totally understood in this matter. So from the Brazilian perspective here, the telework here have two basic principles. I mean, two basic features that you should observe. The first one is when you say telework is a work that shall be done out of the facilities. I mean, all work, all services that you provide out of your facilities of the company, out of the company for itself. Here, you can say that you are in a telework scenario. So if you take services here from your employee as a company, okay, out of the facility, you are in a teleworking scenario, okay? And the way of taking the services is important. You should organize yourself. You should structure your flows, your way of taking services from any kind of IT devices or telecommunications devices. Okay? So the idea is telework is basically working out of the facility, okay, out of the company's premises by using IT devices, telecommunications devices. Okay, so the idea of teleworking, why we are saying that? Because the idea of the teleworking instantaneously drive us to the idea of working from home, which is not necessarily a totally true. Okay, if you work out of your facility, regardless if it's in your home or in your bedroom, for instance, or in your home office. It is a kind of teleworking, but you can work from shopping centers, you can work for the libraries, you can work for any place using notebooks, using smartphones, and so on. And if you do so, you are working in a teleworking environment. That's why I'm saying. So it's the concept is more general. It's not only working from home. You can work every place you want to. Okay. But the condition here is you have to be using IT devices, telecommunications devices. Right, Chris? Will you have something
Yes.
to sum up here?
Yes, and this point is very important because this is what distinguishes the telework from external work. Because if you are an employee that works externally, that doesn't mean that necessarily you can do your activity from inside the working place. So that's very different from the telework. So if you work with IT devices from your home or at distance from the working environment, you are a telework employee. But if you work externally, and you don't need to be inside the company to exercise your activities, you are an external worker. I think that's
Yeah,
the main difference between the two figures.
exactly. Why we are saying that? Because for instance, Tamura, for the overtime matters here, okay, you have the two figures here, the the worker that renders service outside the company, which we call external worker, okay. Some for instance, a seller, a computer seller, a machine seller. This guy is as an external worker because this guy doesn't necessarily work within the company, okay, but he can go to the company as well sometimes. This guy is an external worker. External worker has nothing to do with the home officer worker. Okay, home officer worker is someone who has a a a computer at home or in a fixed place, okay, and with enables him to work or her to work outside the company, not necessarily selling or not necessarily going to the clients as a external worker, okay. And for instance, the external worker does necessarily use IT devices. A seller, this guy does not use, for instance, a notebook, cannot necessarily use a notebook to work for. He can go to the client just selling goods, okay, or just selling products. But both guys, just a home office worker and an external worker, are considered without any time control from the company, which is important that we are going to clarify within the next 15 minutes, the point of working time. But this concept is important to the employers and companies to understand very well. For instance, that the telework has nothing to do with external working. External working can be done, can be implemented without an IT devices, and telework necessary demands IT device to occur. Okay, that's it. Next, please. As I mentioned to you, the teleworking in Brazil is very well established, laid down in a very specific law here, which we call Brazilian Consolidation Labor Law, which is a CLT. Okay, in the Brazilian labor consolidation, we, in the articles 62.3 here, we have some regulations about, general regulations about the telework. Basically requirements, basically instructions about what the employer shall observe in order to make good of a teleworking services. Okay, so the first advice and what the labor law says about the teleworking. The teleworking shall be implemented by the employer through a written agreement. It cannot be verbally agreed a telework services. Right, Chris? You, as an
Yes,
employer, has to write to lay down what do you want to do in your teleworking through a,
yeah,
a written agreement.
yeah,
That,
through the employment contract or an amendment of the employment contract. It does not, it should not be established through a working policy, through an email, after a meeting. It has to be formally established through the employment contract. And the employee must agree with it. It cannot be established only through the employer decision. It has to be an agreement between employee and employer.
exactly. It means that if the employee does not want to go work from their homes, there is no teleworking in the future. I mean, you cannot implement it. It can be agreed, okay, by the employee. That's the matter, because it demands you a agreement, a amendment, or some documents that stately express the agreement of the employee. That's the first rule. If you don't do so, you don't have a teleworking here environment at your company. Okay.
Yes, and it is important to be said that in this employment contract, this agreement, the employer must establish if the employee will have his working time controlled or not, to avoid problems in the future with labor claims regarding labor hours.
Yeah, it is. So what you have to written agree in this amendment, Chris? Basically, what can Paris has to agree? So, firstly, the working time, if you want to. Secondly, how the expenses of this telework will be addressed. What will be paid? Because the employee cannot support the expenses from the teleworking services. The company has to pay all the expenses related to that. I mean, mobile expenses, uh, uh, computer. I mean, all the machines that will be used in the teleworking shall be provided by the company. All the, for instance, the working computing station that will be used by the employee, the chair that the employee will sit can be provided by the company as well. So in overall terms here, the amendment will expressly say what kind of devices will be supported by the company and how it will be done during the working agreement, right? And we are here stressing that employees, as a general rule, cannot pay, cannot support these expenses for their own. The expenses shall be paid for the company. It is mandatory for the teleworking regime, for the teleworking scenario. Okay? Well, of course that if employee starts working from their home here, it's not necessarily means that is a for good situation. It is a situation that will last forever. I mean, the employer has the right to change the telework regime for a normal regime whenever the company wants. Okay, it's not a result of acquired right from the employee perspective that once he is or she is relocated to a home office situation, it's not necessarily means that he will be in a home office situation for good. Okay? In this case here, if the employer decide to change the telework regime for a normal one, it is possible, but the employer has to let the employee know about he will change the telework regime for a normal one. And the deadline for that, the employer has to respect 15 days earlier the changing of the regime. So what I'm saying here is the employer has to warn the employee, I mean, prior to 15 days to the date of the changing of the regime from the telework scenario for the normal one. So 15 days, the employee has to be aware that his life or her life will be changed. Okay, right, Chris?
Yes, it is. And it's important that the employer amends again his employment contract. That now, from now on, it will be from a work inside and not telework anymore.
Exactly. So for ceasing the telework activities, the employer has to give a prior notice of 15 days. Basically, that's it, what we are expecting. Okay? But the main characters of the telework here is teleworkers are not under any time control. There is no time control for this kind of agreement. Okay? It means that we don't have a time limit, a working day limit that we usually have for normal employees within the facilities. I don't know if you are aware about the limitation of the working time here in Brazil, but as a constitutional rule here, employees are not allowed to work more than 8 hours per day and 44 hours per week. If the employee exceeds this time limitation, we are going to have here working time, basically. And how you measure the working time? By using time control methods, time control devices, okay? If you do here the teleworking, hello, we have here in another scenario, you don't have time control, you don't have time limits, or you don't have any working day constitutional limit to be observed by the company, which is, that's the general rule. So in practical terms here, if you are in a home office here, Juridically speaking, okay, we don't have overtime. That's a very crucial consequence for the company who adopts telework. All employees that are removed from the company facilities to a outside facility here, they don't have the right to plead for overtime if they work more than 8 hours per day or 10 hours per day. Okay, but I though that it's crazy, we will be saying that in advance, some kinds of cultures that shall be observed by the employers in order not for the employees does not have this working time. So Chris, go ahead.
Yes, first of all, we recommend that the employer establish in the employment contract that the employee will not have his working time controlled. This information should also be in his employment booklet. And it's important that in the day-by-day basis, the employee does not have his working hours controlled in an indirect form through everyday morning email or through demand of some information by the end of the day by the manager, a logging or log off kind of time control, because he might use this information to request in an eventual labor claim that although he had established in his employment contract that he did not have a working time control, in a day-by-day basis, it happened through informal ways. So it's important to lecture the managers that they shall not control their employees that work through telework working time.
Yeah, exactly. What we are saying here is in order to be out of any timing obligation or overtime paying obligation, okay, without any obligation resulted from control of the working time, the employer cannot, implement during the teleworking scenario any sort of time control, passwords control, right, Chris, and any kind of obligations from the employee perspective that leads to any obligation of being how can I say, or be controlled. Any kind of control here shall be established by the employer, okay, in order to avoid, here is important, overtime payments, okay, or overtime discussions. Okay, that's, we believe that are crucial. So just to wrap up here, we have the teleworking that shall be implemented by a written agreement. Expenses shall be paid by the company, secondly. Third, employees are not owned or are not entitled to any overtime perspective if they are in a home office scenario, okay?
And I think that is an important point, George. It must be done mainly at distance.
Okay, yeah, it's another important thing here is to be qualified as an homework here or as a telework. If you have to work the most of time, the majority of time at your home. So, for instance, if you are saying here in a working day from Monday to Friday, which is the normally a weekly day here in Brazil, okay? The employee has to work at home at least 3 days for a week. So 2 days, I mean, during the weekly time, the employee can go to the company work. There is no problem. Okay, it doesn't disqualify the teleworking work scenario here. But what is important here is the majority of the week. I mean, at least 3 days, 3 days at a week, the employee has to work on home. If he does that, I mean, the telework scenario here will be uh, qualified, will be characterized under the Brazilian labor law. Okay? I think that's it. The basic requirements of the telework in Brazil by the Brazilian labor consolidation. Next, please. You can go through, Chris. Would you like to explain that?
Jorge,
Okay.
I'm sorry, I think I was muted. We have a question here. Should we leave it
Okay.
to the end of the presentation?
Now, we can go. Good morning. During the pandemic period, our company implemented telework, and we are still in. However, little by little, we are returning in a shift condition to our condition. I'm from the HR department. In order to close out our time shift, most have in office and part-time home jobs. I always ask for Excel time sheet. It is wrong. Okay. I will read in a loud voice here the question. Okay, Chris.
And he also says in the beginning, our company did not explain about extra hours, so some are just wrote in Excel sheet and ordinary hours every day, but parts are written real work hour. So I have to pay the extra hours. Well, if the company has established from the beginning that the employee has his working time controlled, of course, the employer has to pay for the overtime. And this working time controls can be done by an Excel timesheet, but it's important to say that the Excel timesheet must translate exactly working time of the employee. But it must not be adjusted or adapted according to the employer will. Yeah. So you may carry out the working sheet because you had done like that from the beginning. So it's difficult to change it now. But once you have, if the company decides to keep the teleworking after the pandemic period, after the provisional measure time that we'll talk within the next minutes, which ends on December 2020, you might agree with your workers a teleworking amendment through the labor consolidation, and then you might establish that they won't have the working hours controlled. Do you agree, Georgie?
Yeah, I agree. So basically, what you have mentioned here for Kubota-san here, yes, the situation that you create for yourself is you establish a time control scenario here. And once you establish this time control scenario, you lose the guarantee of the law that the overtime will not be done. So you have to pay the overtime. And why you have to pay the overtime in this case? Because you have a time control here. You, for yourself, for your own, establish a time control through the Excel spreadsheet. So this is a time control. And once you have a time control, you have to pay overtime. If you want to avoid paying overtime for the telework scenario, you have to extinguish, you have to cease any kind of time control in this case. So if you have to extinguish, if you cease this time control procedure, so then you won't have to pay overtime. That's it. Okay? Did you got it, Kubata-san? And what you can do it from now, well, in this case here, you have two decisions to go through. Stop time controlling. Stop trying to make any kind of Excel spreadsheet. And then you're going to have the possibility of not paying overtime. Okay? But if you decide to go through this system, try to be more objective as you can, and try to be try to reflect the reality of the working as much as you can in this Excel spreadsheet. Okay? And try to get any kind of acceptance of the working done from the employee perspective. And then you have to pay overtime, but in overtime in a very specific situation, and that shall be confirmed by the employee. Did you got it? Okay. Okay, since I'm already paid it for a three-person company, it's strange if I quit right now. Yeah, I mean, it can be asked by the employees, okay, but it's not a quiet right. I mean, from their perspective, you have once you have taken out the time controlling here, you are saying then that they don't are submitted for any kind of labor journey here, okay, and then he cannot plead you, he cannot request for overtime, okay? But in order to do so here, we suggest you to make an amendment, I mean, or to obtain from them the acceptance that you are not having a time controlling anymore. So for this point of view, they are not being entitled to any overtime, okay? If you do so, perhaps you're gonna have more security for the labor perspective in order to avoid liabilities. For instance, liabilities that came from overtime. Okay? Yes, you can use just for this year, okay, for the pandemic scenario. And then if we continues for the next year, you can amendment the agreement and state expressly that these employees are not submitted to any time control. It is possible as well. Yes, exactly, through an amendment. Okay,
Yes.
great. Chris, talk about the next one. What are our perspective, Chris, in Brazil? I mean, companies, here we have a lot of clients, right, using the telework scenario, the telework regime, right?
Yes, as you have been said before, the telework has been recently regulated by our legislation. So it wasn't very experimented before, but as the pandemic affected our working scenario, all the companies adopted the teleworking, and now we can see that the the private sector has adapted very fast, and employers and employees are willing to maintain this regime of work throughout the years. I think it's a very modern way of uh, working, and it adapts very well to our personal way of life, and it will continue after the pandemic. But it is
Yeah.
important uh, to adopt it in a secure way. And if you, Tamura-san, if you may exchange the slide, please. I think, yes. And what are the main points that we have to be aware of to adopt this regime in a secure way? We have to talk with the employee about his environment, about his work environment, about the importance to not extend their working hours, uh, about the importance to separate his personal life from his working life in order not to stress him. I think we have some important uh, uh, advantages to the workers as less time commuting, uh, less expenses in order to go to work, but it is also important to say to the employee that he has to be aware of his work environment at home in order not to stress his personal and working life in his new way of working. I think that is very important. Also, in order to avoid occupational disease and working accidents, that's something very new that we have to deal in this new working scenario. And it's something that the employer has to be very aware of and has to work very closely with his teleworkers through a very objective HR policy. I think these are the
Okay,
main points.
yeah. So it's a good option to have the telework in Brazil. It raise the productivity, decrease the commuting time, and so on. However, limits to be reasonable for the employers in order to avoid stress for the employees is good. Okay, to be to pay attention so much about occupational disease. What is occupational disease? Is the disease that the employee can have from working. So occupational disease, if the employee has occupational disease here, the employer can have problems because here we have a lot of indemnities and a lot of liabilities that can be arisen from this kind of disease. So if you want to establish at your home, at your company, the homework or the telework here, it is important to outline here that the employer is totally responsible for what happens for the employee while she's working at home. And if the employee succeed by proving in courts that he or she got any disease from the teleworking, such as stress disease, I would say that such as occupational disease, or I would say, or any mental disease that could come from that, the employer will be responsible under the labor courts. That's why so very, very crucial for the companies to make or to implement, I would say, safety and health measures for the employee. Frequently, exams are frequently checkups here, medical checkups for the employee is crucial in order to mitigate, to reduce the labor risks for the companies. The fact that the employee is not in the company's facility does not necessarily mean that the company has no responsibilities from the employee perspective. Okay? So it's not only to let the employees at their homes and not to be aware or not to use any kind of I would say any kind of measures, safety measures, medical measures, in order to see, to check if the employee is working according to the safety provisions, according to the medical provisions. It is the company's responsibility to be aware of that, to be aware that the employee is working according to the labor regulation, to the safety regulations, to the health regulations. Okay?
Yes,
Although, or otherwise, Chris, right, the employer will be fully, will be totally responsible for the employees' health conditions.
yes, and it is important to say that the labor law demands that the employee formally sign an agreement saying that he will comply with the health and safety measures established by the company for the
Yeah,
teleworking.
exactly. So, Tamura-san, all companies here in Brazil has safety and health policies. It's an obligation for them under the Brazilian labor law. So, even for the employees that are in a teleworking regime, they have to observe those safety rules, those health rules. And the company has an obligation to check, to confirm weekly, monthly, yearly, if those employees are observing that, or if those employees are working according to the company's policy. And the company has to, to all sort of documentation, registration that the company is
Pro,
somehow
yeah.
monitoring, I would say, this employee, if this employee has observing all the safety and health rules that comes from the company, right? It is crucial because if this employee argues from or under the labor courts that she or he has a work disease, which is very expensive for the company perspective because it comes from a very huge liability from the company. If this employee argues this kind of work occupational disease, if the company has no appropriate documentation, has no appropriate written proofs that the company did everything in order to be very conscious about these matters, I mean, occupational safety rules, probably the employer will face problems, will
Yes,
face liabilities, okay?
yes, it might establish some health and safety training programs, even if it's remotely. through a strict HR policy. We think this is important and we recommend it to our clients.
Yeah, this is. Okay, next one, please. Well, here we don't have a lot of thing to comment here because the provisional measure has already expired. I mean, we don't have it anymore. Okay, we have here only the CLT, the labor consolidation obligations that we have mentioned. So what is important to mention here is the provisional measure in general terms becomes more easier to implement the telework because there was no need for the employee to accept. I mean, the employer, the company can implement in a unilateral way the telework. I mean, there is no need for acceptance for the employee perspective. Okay. The employer has only to give a 2 days prior notice for the employee to let him know that he will be in a teleworking regime. So there is no need to let their known, I mean, within the 48 hours, okay? And this notice can be done in writing or electronically, I mean, just by email. There is no need for amendment, as I mentioned to you. I mean, there is no a formal documentation for that. Only email was okay to inform the employee about the teleworking here. Costs shall be agreed. There's not an obligation only for the company to pay the costs of the teleworking here. It can be shared or not. Okay. And that's it. But unfortunately, we don't have this provisional measure anymore. It has already expired here. And we only have here the CLT Article 62.3 that we have already mentioned in the second slide. Okay? We don't have much reason to waste time here in this slide. Just for let you know what the Brazilian government did for the pandemic situation. Next, please. Here we have a charter here with a very practical comparison about the Brazilian labor code and the provisional measure. What they changed, for instance, we didn't have for the provision measure the obligation of contractual amendment. There is no necessary the consent from the employee perspective. Here we have the I have a mistake here. The obligation to supply technology is the provisional measure is the obligation for the
Employers,
company,
yes.
for the employers, and for the labor perspective, we don't have the obligation. It can be mutually agreement by the amendment here. Okay. One important thing here, Amura-san. Teleworking here, it's only applied, for the employees.
For
Telework
employment
cannot be
contracts.
applied for internships or for apprentices. Okay, there is no need, there is no space for putting your interns at home after the pandemic. You cannot use that.
Okay, Jorge, we have an important question here. May I read it for you?
Yeah, sure.
And he says, hi, regarding provisional measure 927, as I wrote before, we are still in home office based on this law. Again, we are in a wrong way. So the best is to quit this agreement totally based on the provisional measure and make a new one.
Go ahead, Fred.
as we have been said before, the agreements establish while the provisional measure 927 was valid, can be carried on until December 2020. After that, you have to decide, the company has to decide if it wants to go on with the teleworking and then establish a new agreement with its employees. But for now, you are regular. You may carry on the agreement established while the provisional measure 927 was valid. So you have no worries here. Is that understood, Mr. Kubota? You're welcome.
Okay, next one. Go ahead, please.
Well, here we have the advantage and the disadvantage of teleworking. Okay, one of the advantages is the lower costs for the company, but the day-by-day costs as light, water, internet, even office facilities. Many companies here in Brazil that have decided to adopt the teleworking from now on are changing to smaller offices. So it really means a lower cost for the company. We also have lower exposures to violence. As you know, Brazil is a violent country. So as the workers will have to commute less, they will be less exposed to violence. We have more employment opportunities to disabled people, so because they won't have to commute, they may work from home with their structure and family besides them, so that's a very positive point. Less exposure to pollution and less pollution to the world, as we will have less cars on the streets. It has also a personal indicator that workers will have better meals at home. Time flexibility is also positive. Better quality of life, less time commuting, as we have said before. Less absenteeism. It's a very important point for the companies. On the other hand, workers will have freedom to organize their taxes, flexibility in working relationships, higher interaction with their family, less stress, balance it between working and lifetime. These are all points that we have, that we understand that represent advantage for workers that are now teleworking. But we also have some disadvantages, especially in this new scenario. And you just put before like higher costs for the employee if the company does not intend to share with them the new costs with internet, electricity, water, supplies, costs with equipment, establishing a working station at home. Some employers must face organizational difficulties, distractions with domestic tasks, difficulty in developing their career because they are away from the working place for their bosses and colleagues. That's something that must be seen by the company too and by the HR departments. Like some of them might complain of lack of recognition by the co-workers, lack of supervision too. So it's very important to create a new culture life within the companies regarding the telework. I'm sorry, I have been muted. Can you hear me now? So these are the main points that we may stress out now regarding the advantages and disadvantages of teleworking, especially by the worker's point of view. I think we might pass out to the next. Yes. Now we
Okay,
have the.
Grace, to conclude here, basically for the companies that are in this webinar, what is important by the end of the day, okay? By the teleworking scenario. First one, avoid time control. If you want to get the benefit of not paying overtime, so let out giving out, extinguish, cease any kind of time control procedures. First one. Secondly, make a very clear policy of the working or of the teleworking and make your amendments very clear, stating exactly what are the costs, what are the activities that shall be developed under the teleworking, who are eligible for the teleworking at your company as well. It's important to establish. Fourth, during the teleworking here, you companies are not obliged to pay transport costs, of course, and meal costs because the employee here will be at home. Okay, so basically, there is no need to pay transportation voucher because there is no commuting time. For meal, there is a discussion here, meal voucher, but it can be agreed with the employee here if the company wants to not pay meal. But please, if the company decides not pay meal voucher for the employee who are in the teleworking scenario, it should be agreed by both parties. Okay. Another thing is the company has to guarantee that the employee is working according to their policies, their health policies, their safety policies. It is important because I mentioned to you there will be here very huge liability that comes from working diseases. And in order to avoid this kind of liability, company has to be very strong in terms of proofs, in terms of documentation that they did everything that could be possible in order to avoid working disease. Okay? Next advice, be sure that your employee is enjoying meal breaks. Okay? Be sure that you have been observing the reason, you have been, how can I say, you have been using the reason, you have been, how can I say, the express word here? You have been reasonable about the daily time. It's not fair for the employee if you send mails, if you make orders after the working time, after, for instance, 11 p.m., 12 p.m. Okay, try to make everything as possible during the working time. In here in Brazil, the working time is from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Okay, try to avoid requesting things or establish any kind of obligation, reporting obligation, and someone, for instance, at 10 p.m. at the night, and so on. Because labor authorities in Brazil, Tamura-san, they are very protective in favor of the employee. That's the reason. And overtime here is a crucial matter when you say teleworking. So the more you get limit to the working time in Brazil, which is from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., the more chances that you have for not having liabilities, for not having any labor claims against you. Try to be reasonable about the working time. That's the rule. Try to respect, okay, the time limit of 8 hours per day and 40 hours per week. Although you don't have time control, although you don't have the right of overtime here, okay, if you abuse of the right of requesting things from your employee, probably you're going to have problems. Any else, Chris? Anything else?
No, I think that is, I think it's important to distinguish the telework from the home office because, as you have said before, teleworking is the one that is done mainly at distance, at home. And the home working is not ruled in Brazil, but it's a kind of work that entitles the employee to more flexibility. He can combine with his immediately manager that he might once a week or eventually work from his home. That's different from teleworking, where there is a formal amendment to the employment contract establishing that he will work mainly at distance, uh, especially from his home, and he will only be at the office eventually. That's completely different from home office, isn't it, Georgie?
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. That's why it's so important to establish the difference between the concepts that we did in the beginning of this presentation. Well, I think that's it. Our time has already gone, right, Tamura-san? Here, we are here, we open to the questions that you might have. We have leave the,
Yes.
we will have this presentation at, I mean, we have sent to you, right? All the clients that may be interested.
Or do you want to do this Q&A?
Yeah, the Q&A is the last part. I mean, was the presentation part here. We has already finished. So, Chris, let's go through the most important questions that we have faced
Yes,
for
of course.
everybody.
Yes, of course. We have a first question here that says the work can be carried out from anywhere outside the company site, and considering that the employer, as a rule, bears the travel costs, if the employee is living in another city or even in another country by his own choice and attendance is requested, who should pay for these expenses? The employer or the employee? We have already put the answer here, but what says is if the choice of living abroad is from the employee, we believe that the expenses should be his, but that must be well established at the employment contract. The employment contract must address which is the current address of the employee, and that was his choice to live there, even though knowing that his employer is established in another region. We have a second question here that says, if there is a possibility to monitor the employee's workday by logging into the computer system or the technological means, why doesn't the teleworker get paid for overtime work? Now we have covered this before because now after the labor law reform, we have a specific article at our labor code, Article 62, Item 1, Item 3, that says that teleworkers are not entitled to overtime once they have not his working time controlled. So that's why it's important to establish an employment contract if the teleworker will or will not have his working time controlled. I think we might go to the next question. Our third question is, if the employee had an accident or an occupational disease as a teleworker, does the company have any responsibility? Yes, of course. As George has said before, it is very important that the company instruct their employees about all the cares that they have to have with the and precautions that they have to have with their safety and health while teleworking. They have to have a proper workstation. They have to take the rests, their rest. They should not do overtime, and because of that, it is important that the company establish a very direct human resources policy, working together with the safety department of the company. I think we have another question here. A doubt regarding the question 2 of the Q&A. Our participant is asking, what about if the supervisor demand for a daily report of the employee activities? Not about hours, but just activities. Well, I think that must be done, but it's important how the report will be asked for and addressed. Because that might represent a great risk for the company regarding overtime. So that's why Georgie said that it's important that the employer does not ask for a high volume of work. It's not because the employee is working at home that his day-by-day tasks should be increased. Okay. Do we have any other questions in our Q&A, Tamura-san?
I think we do have. This is the next slide.
We have already mentioned that brand news reality. Yes, it is. It's gonna be our normal here in Brazil. Okay. We are not sure if it's gonna be a real tendency or if it's gonna pass, I mean, within the next 2 years. But as Chris mentioned previously, it's up to the company here to see exactly if the telework will be necessary or not, good or not. There's not a general rule that, I mean, all the newspapers, everybody say, oh, teleworking will be a way that there is no way out. Okay, I mean, it is the normal rule. No, I don't think so. It depends on the company's reality. It depends on the activity that is done. I believe that extinguish the, I mean, totally distinguish the local working, I mean, within the facility, I think is not a good idea as well, because it's good for the employee goes to the company exactly to know who are their colleagues, what are the company's targets and so on. So for doing that, it's important to go to the company. So I don't think that the teleworking per se, okay, has only advantages. But it is something that has already strength, and it is something that is very regulated in Brazil. It's not so freely. There is no freedom as United States, as United Kingdom to go through this kind of work. Here we have strong concepts, strong protection from the employee point of view. Again, labor courts here are quite protective. Okay, the fact that you establish teleworking does not necessarily mean from the company that you are not responsible anymore.
And,
Okay,
and as yes,
sorry.
and as you have said before, I think the two main concerns the employers must have regarding telework is overtime and occupational diseases. That's something
Yeah,
that
the protection.
these, yeah, these are red lights for the companies.
And to finish our presentation, I would finalize here with the home office environment is an extension of the facility of the company. Okay? What I mean as an extension, if you make a home office regime at your home, the company is at your home. And as an extension of the company, the employer has obligation, has a has a lot of duties to observe under the Brazilian labor law. So before implementing the teleworking regime at your company, try to map, try to see what are or what you have in your hands to protect the company from those liability. And to protect the company means to have the policies, to have the safety and health measures to monitor the teleworking environment. I think that is the best advice that we do for the companies here. And why to do so? In order to avoid discussions about disease, about working disease that could come from this type of work. I think that's our main message here, right, Cristiana?
Yeah, yes, it is.
Any questions so far?
Oh, yes, we have one last question here. Let me read it for us. That is, sorry, last question. For the next year, if our company decides to keep the teleworking based on the CLT, our labor code, is it possible to have some type of mix, part in teleworking and part in company? Something like a week in a month in office and 2 weeks in home. Probably during the office time, we will pay for extra hours because there is a time control, relógio de ponto. But during the home office, there won't be. Well, as we have explained before, teleworking in Brazil is different from home office. We believe that this type of mixed regime must represent a risk for the company because it's not exactly as the teleworking regulated by law 13,467 as you have mentioned in your question. It is more like a flexible arrangement between employee and employer. It is not teleworking. In these cases, we believe that it is more secure for the company to establish a work policy regulating home office, and we don't advise the companies not to control the working time while the employee is working from home. It is important that the employee that have this kind of flexible arrangement with the employer have his working time control. while he is working in the office and while he is working at home. Have we answered your question? Is there any doubt remained?
I think so. Well, that's it. I would like to thanks to thank you for everybody. I mean, it was a pleasure here to be with you. I hope that could be a very productive meeting. We are at your fully disposal here. I mean, we are fully available to answer any question that you might have. If you want to send those questions to Tamura-san, and Tamura-san can resend, I mean, can send it for us for a further analysis and further answer as well. Okay? Thank you so much for having this time for you, and have a great week. A great
Thank
feeling
you.
week. Thank you so much. See ya.
Thank you. Bye-bye.